Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when someone tells you not to do something, but every fiber of your being screams at you to find out why? That's exactly what Sarah Mitchell felt when she heard those words on her first day of work. It was 7 o'clock on a rainy Monday morning in October 2019, and she had just arrived at Whitmore Manor, an imposing Victorian house nestled among the giant pine trees on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. Mrs. Henderson, the 70-year-old housekeeper with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, gripped Sarah's arm with surprising force, looked directly into her eyes with a seriousness that froze the air between them, and repeated slowly, syllable by syllable, "Never." Sarah was young, only 28, a recent nursing school graduate desperate to pay off her student debt, which exceeded $60,000. When she saw the advertisement offering a salary 3 times above market rate to care for an elderly patient, with lodging included in a historic mansion, she didn't think twice. Red flag. Maybe. But bills don't pay themselves, right? Have you ever had to accept something that seemed too good to be true just because you had no choice? For the first 2 days, everything seemed relatively normal. Sarah cared for Mr. Edmund Whitmore, a kind and quiet 87-year-old man who spent his afternoons lost among old books in the first-floor library. The house was enormous, full of creaking corridors and shadows that danced on the walls when the evening light streamed through the stained glass windows. But there was that door, at the end of the second-floor corridor, always locked, always silent. And the more Sarah tried not to think about it, the more it occupied her thoughts. Stay with me until the end, because what happened on the third night will leave you breathless. It was 2:37 a.m. when Sarah woke up. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a sound. Soft, distant, almost ghostly. A melody, a music box playing. By itself somewhere in the empty house. Her heart raced. She descended the creaking stairs from the 3rd floor, where her guest room was, to the 2nd floor, shrouded in thick shadows. And then she saw it. A sliver of golden light beneath that forbidden door. The music was coming from there, and the air was completely different. Heavy, dense, wrong, as if every molecule of oxygen carried the weight of something old, of an unresolved pain, of a secret buried alive. Sarah's feet began to walk on their own. She didn't decide to go there. Her body simply went as if pulled by an invisible force. When her hand touched the cold doorknob, she realized she was trembling, and when she turned it, the door opened. What you are about to discover may surprise you in ways you never imagined. Before I tell you what Sarah found on the other side of that door, I need to ask you something. Seriously. If you're feeling that tightness in your chest, that curiosity mixed with a chill down your spine, if this story is affecting you in any way, please like this video now. Because stories like this, real stories about real people facing their fears and pain, need to be heard. And your like is what allows YouTube to show this content to more people who also need to hear it. And look, I know this topic resonates with you. Maybe you have your own locked room, that thing in your life you avoid facing, that emotional place you don't want to enter. Leave a comment below about what has resonated with you the most so far. Have you ever felt this kind of fear? This calling to discover something that everyone tells you to leave alone? I read every comment, truly, and your story matters as much as Sarah's. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button below. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Stories that remind us of our humanity, our fragility, but also our courage. Turn on notifications too, because every week I bring you real stories that will make you feel, think, and maybe even see your own life in a different way. Now, take a deep breath with me, because what Sarah saw when she entered that room will break your heart, but it will also show you something beautiful about human nature and how we deal with loss. The door opened slowly, creaking as if it hadn't been touched in decades, and then Sarah saw a child's room, completely preserved, frozen in time. The walls painted sky blue with white clouds that seemed to float, a small bed with sheets printed with astronauts and planets, shelves organized with toys that had clearly been loved, used, lived in, children's books stacked with covers worn by the constant touch of small hands. And there, in the center of the room, on a small lightwood table, a music box played that heartbreaking melody by itself. Sarah felt tears welling up before she even fully understood what she was seeing, because there was something in that space that transcended the physical. It was as if someone's love had been crystallized within those four walls, as if each object carried a memory so intense that the very air vibrated with it. On the walls, framed photographs showed a blond boy with bright blue eyes, a wide and genuine smile, the kind that lights up any room, and in each photo, beside him, a man Sarah recognized immediately, even decades younger, Mr. Edmund Whitmore, radiant with a happiness she had never seen, on his face during those 3 days of work. The transformation between the man in the photographs and the silent gentleman she cared for was brutal, as if all that light had been extinguished at once, leaving only the shell of who he used to be. Sarah walked slowly through the room, her fingers lightly touching the objects as if they were sacred relics. A toy rocket, a small globe, children's drawings stuck to the wall with tape yellowed with age. And then she saw, on the bedside table, a framed photograph different from the others. The boy wearing astronaut pajamas, hugging a brown teddy bear, looking directly at the camera with those eyes full of dreams and infinite possibilities. It was then that Sarah heard the voice behind her. His name was Thomas. She turned so quickly she almost lost her balance. Mr. Edmund Whitmore was standing in the doorway, leaning on his dark wooden cane, wearing his striped pajamas. But what broke Sarah's heart were his eyes. Red, swollen, tears streaming freely down his wrinkled cheeks without any attempt to hide them. And for the first time since she had arrived at that house, he truly spoke. Not those short, polite phrases about the weather or the food. He spoke like someone who had carried a silent weight for too long and had finally found someone willing to listen. Thomas Whitmore was his grandson, the light of his life after his wife Eleanor passed away in 1996. The boy came to live with him when he was only 6 years old after. His parents, Edmund's only daughter, and the son-in-law he loved like a son, died in a car accident on a frozen road in the dead of winter. For a whole year, that dark and silent mansion was transformed. Laughter echoed through the hallways, games of hide-and-seek among the 17 rooms, stories of astronauts and distant planets read aloud every night before bed. Thomas had a fierce imagination and a heart as big as the universe he dreamed of exploring. And then, one morning in September 1998, Thomas simply didn't wake up. A brain aneurysm, silent, treacherous, without warning, without goodbye. No chance to say I love you one more time. Edmund found his grandson in bed, hugging his teddy bear, seemingly sleeping peacefully. But he was gone, and with him, all the light in that house. Edmund locked the room that very day. He kept the key with Mrs. Henderson and gave an order that would never be questioned for 21 years. No one enters there, ever. Now Sarah understood everything. The heavy silence, the inexplicable tears at 9 o'clock at night, the sadness that seemed to have roots so deep they reached the center of the earth. That room wasn't just a locked room. It was a piece of Edmund's heart that he couldn't process, couldn't face, couldn't let go of. It was his own interrupted journey with the person he loved most in this world. And there, in that vulnerable and sacred moment, Sarah realized something fundamental about human nature. Sometimes, our greatest prisons don't have iron bars. Sometimes they have blue walls painted with clouds and are locked with the key of unprocessed pain. But the story doesn't end there. What happened in the following days between Sarah and Edmund will show you that the revelation in that room completely changed the dynamic between Sarah and Edmund. In the days that followed, a hidden truth began to emerge from behind the scenes of that silent mansion. Edmund was not just an elderly patient in need of basic care. He was a man trapped in an emotional journey that had been brutally paused 21 years ago and never resumed. And Sarah, without knowing exactly how, had become the first person in over 2 decades to witness the full extent of that pain. The morning after that revelatory night, Edmund went down to breakfast with different eyes. Still sad, still burdened, but there was something new there, an almost imperceptible relief. as if an emotional abscess that had been festering for years had finally been drained. He sat at the kitchen table, something he rarely did, preferring to eat his meals alone in the library. Sarah served pancakes with maple syrup, and for a long moment they ate in silence. But it was a different kind of silence, no longer heavy and suffocating. It was contemplative, almost peaceful. "You must think I'm a crazy old man," Edmund said suddenly, his hoarse voice breaking the silence. Sarah stopped with her fork in the air and looked directly at him. "Locking a room for 21 years, as if that would bring someone back." There was brutal self-criticism in those words, but also a painful lucidity. Edmund knew exactly what he had done. It wasn't denial. It was a conscious choice to freeze a moment in time because moving forward meant accepting the unacceptable. Sarah put her fork down and took a deep breath before answering. "I think you loved your grandson more than anything in this world, and I don't think anyone taught you how to process such a devastating loss." The words came out with a raw honesty that surprised even herself, but they were true. Edmund had been a university professor of literature, someone who spent his days immersed in other people's narratives, analyzing fictional characters and their arcs of transformation. But when his own story was shattered, he had no tools to cope. So he did what many of us do. He locked away the pain and threw away the key. The impact of those words was visible on Edmund's face. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back more tears, and nodded slowly. "Eleanor, my wife, was the one who knew how to deal with emotions. I was always the rational, analytical one. When she died, I was already lost. When Thomas arrived, he saved me without even knowing it. And when he left," Edmund's voice completely failed. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah understood perfectly. When Thomas died, Edmund lost not only his grandson, but also his emotional anchor, his renewed purpose, his reason to go on. Over the following days, something extraordinary began to happen. Edmund started talking about Thomas, not in a painful and desperate way, but honorably. He told stories during lunch, how Thomas insisted on wearing his superhero cape to school, how he asked impossible questions about the universe that left Edmund speechless, how he was afraid of the dark but pretended to be brave so as not to worry his grandfather. Each story was a revelation, a piece of memory that had been imprisoned for too long and could now finally breathe. Mrs. Henderson watched everything with a mixture of astonishment and relief. One afternoon, she pulled Sarah aside and whispered, her eyes brimming with tears, "In 21 years working here, I never heard you say Thomas's name aloud. Never. What did you do?" Sarah didn't have a clear answer. She had done nothing more than be present. Listen without judgment. Hold a safe space so that the pain could finally be felt instead of just carried. But there was a crucial next step in this journey of transformation, a step that deeply frightened Edmund. Sarah suggested something that seemed absurd at first, but the more Edmund thought about it, the more sense it made. What if we went back to that room? Together. Just for a few minutes. Not to change anything. Just to be there consciously. Edmund's mindset was beginning to shift. For the first time in decades, he was considering that perhaps keeping that room as an untouchable sanctuary wasn't honoring Thomas's memory. He was only prolonging the agony. If you've ever had to make a difficult decision about how to deal with the memory of someone you've lost, write below, "I understand." Let's show Edmund, wherever he is, that he wasn't alone in this struggle. And it was exactly 3 days after that conversation in the kitchen that Edmund finally said he was ready. Sarah didn't know it yet, but what they were about to discover together in that room would transform not only the decision to enter that room together was only the beginning of a transformation far more profound than either of them could have imagined. In the first few minutes inside that preserved space, Edmund stood paralyzed at the door. His breathing became ragged. His hands trembled, gripping his cane so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sarah didn't rush him. She simply stood there beside him, a silent but solid presence, showing through her body language that he wasn't alone on this frightening journey back to the past. After almost 5 minutes that felt like an eternity, Edmund took his first step inside, and then another, and another. He walked to the small bed with the astronaut sheets and sat slowly on the edge, as if testing whether the piece of furniture was still real or just a cruel mirage. His fingers touched the time-faded fabric, and something in it broke in a different way. It wasn't the break of initial discovery. It was the break of acceptance. Those tears that streamed down were different from the previous ones. They were the tears of someone who was finally allowing the wound to breathe. "I used to sit here every night," Edmund said, his voice breaking, "and read to him. Always a story about space, distant galaxies, brave astronauts exploring the unknown. He said that when he grew up he was going to be the first astronaut to set foot on Mars." A sad but genuine smile appeared on Edmund's wrinkled face. It was the first time Sarah had seen him. Truly smile. And I believed him, completely. Thomas had that determination that some children have, you know, that unwavering certainty that the impossible is just a matter of time. Sarah sat on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wall with the painted clouds. "Do you still have the books you used to read to him?" Edmund nodded, pointing to the shelf by the window. "All there, untouched since September 1998. There was something poetically devastating about that information. Books. Full of adventures, endless possibilities, bright futures, all silenced amidst narratives that would never be completed. It was at that moment that Sarah had a powerful insight into the mindset behind Edmund's decision to lock that room. It wasn't just about preserving memories, it was about freezing potential. Thomas wasn't just a child who had died, he was an entire universe of possibilities that would never come to fruition. Each book on that shelf represented a stolen future. Each toy was an interrupted dream. And keeping everything exactly as it was Edmund's way of saying, "I don't accept this. I refuse to move on without you." But the impact of that revelation brought with it an even deeper truth. By freezing that room, Edmund had also frozen himself. He was 21 years older than the last time he had been there, but emotionally he had never left 1998. His life had become a perpetual state of waiting for something that would never return. And as Sarah watched this 87-year-old man sitting on that child's bed, surrounded by ghosts of past joy, she understood that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about integrating loss into the narrative of life instead of letting it stop the story altogether. Over the following weeks, Edmund and Sarah established a new ritual. Every day in the late afternoon, they spent 15 minutes in that room. Sometimes Edmund told stories. Sometimes he just sat in silence. Sometimes he cried. But always he was present. No more running away. No more locking emotional doors. He was doing the brutal and necessary work of processing a pain that had been festering in the backstage of his soul for over 2 decades. And then Sarah suggested something that initially seemed impossible to Edmund. What if we considered donating some of these toys to children in need? Not all of them, but some. Thomas would have loved to know that his things are bringing joy to other children. The expression on Edmund's face was complex. There was resistance, of course, but there was also something akin to hope, a tiny spark of possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, honoring Thomas's memory didn't mean keeping everything in formaldehyde forever. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. It took 3 more weeks of delicate conversations, tears, resistance, and eventual acceptance. But finally, Edmund agreed. They would start slowly, just a few toys, nothing too personal, and it would go to a children's shelter in Portland that worked specifically with children who had lost their parents. Thomas would understand, Edmund said, his voice firm for the first time in years. He had a huge heart. He would want other grieving children to have a little joy. And it was precisely this transformative mindset that led Edmund to make a decision that no one, not even Sarah, was expecting. A decision that would change not only his life, but the decision Edmund made was as unexpected as it was revolutionary. One November afternoon, he called Sarah into the library and announced something that left even Mrs. Henderson speechless. "I want to transform Thomas's room into a community children's library." The words came out with a clarity and firmness that Sarah hadn't seen in him before. It wasn't an impulsive idea born of guilt or despair. It was a conscious, considered decision, born of weeks of deep and painful emotional work. Edmund had realized something fundamental: keeping. That room as a mausoleum wasn't preserving Thomas's memory. It was imprisoning his legacy. The journey to reach this conclusion had been brutal. Edmund had to confront not only the loss of his grandson, but also the guilt he carried for not having been able to save him. He had spent 21 years wondering if there was anything he could have done differently that fateful morning. Should he have woken Thomas earlier? Should he have noticed some sign? The hidden truth that Sarah helped Edmund unearth was that there was nothing he could have done. Brain aneurysms in children are silent, unpredictable, cruel in their arbitrariness. It was nobody's fault. It was simply a devastating tragedy without explanation or justice. But accepting this also meant accepting that life goes on, that the world didn't stop in September 1998, even if Edmund's heart had stopped, and that there was a choice to be made, to continue living like a ghost haunting his own house, or to find a way to transform this paralyzing pain into something meaningful. Edmund's mindset was shifting from static preservation to dynamic honor. He wanted the joy Thomas brought into his life to multiply, to spread, to touch other children who desperately needed a safe space full of books and possibilities. Implementing this vision took 3 months. Edmund hired a local carpenter to build custom-made wooden bookshelves along the bedroom walls. The painted clouds remained untouched, as did Thomas's bed, which now served as a cozy reading nook with soft cushions. The most personal toys were carefully stored in special boxes that Edmund kept in his own room, where he could visit them whenever he felt the need. But most of the books, those about space and adventures and impossible dreams, remained on the shelves, now joined by hundreds of other titles donated by the Portland community. The impact of this transformation exceeded all expectations. When the Thomas Whitmore Library opened in February 2020, shortly before the pandemic changed the entire world, more than 50 children from the area attended. Edmund, who had spent 2 decades avoiding any contact with children because it was too painful, found himself surrounded by curious, noisy, vibrant little human beings. And something extraordinary happened. For the first time since Thomas died, Edmund smiled as he heard children's laughter. It wasn't the same laughter as Thomas's. It never would be. But it was life. It was joy. It was proof that the love he had for his grandson didn't have to die with him. Sarah watched everything from the sidelines, tears streaming freely. She had arrived at that mansion 6 months ago as a young nurse desperate for a decent wage. But what she found was much more than a job. She found purpose. She witnessed firsthand the transformative power of being present for someone in their deepest pain without trying to fix or rush them. She learned that sometimes the greatest form of care is not doing something for someone, but simply being by that person's side while they do the brutal work of healing themselves. Edmund established a routine. Every Saturday morning, he opened the library for the children of the community. He read stories aloud, just as he had done with Thomas. His voice trembled in the first few weeks, but over time it grew firmer, and the children loved it. There was something about the way this white-haired, kind-eyed gentleman told stories that completely transported them. Perhaps it was the authenticity. Perhaps it was because Edmund had learned through the most devastating loss that stories matter, that imagination matters, that making a child believe in infinite possibilities is one of the most sacred things an adult can do. And then came the final revelation that even Edmund hadn't expected. Among the children who frequented the library was a 7-year-old girl named Maya. She had lost her mother to cancer 6 months earlier and lived with an aunt who worked 2 jobs to support the family. Maya was quiet, withdrawn, carrying a grief that children shouldn't have to bear. But something happened when she entered that room filled with painted clouds and books scattered about space. She opened up. She smiled. She dreamed. If you believe that our greatest pain can be transformed into our greatest gift to the world, write this: purpose is born from pain. These words are powerful and true. One day, Maya asked Edmund if he believed that the people we love who have died can see us from where they are. And Edmund's answer would change everything again, because Maya's question caught Edmund completely off guard. He was crouched beside her, holding an illustrated book about constellations, when those sorrowful brown eyes met his and asked the question he had avoided for 21 years. "Mr. Edmund, do you think my mother can see me from up here? Do you think she knows I miss her every day?" The silence that followed was thick, heavy with all the unanswered questions Edmund had buried along with Thomas. He could have given an evasive, comforting, but empty answer. But something in that moment demanded absolute truth. Edmund sat down completely on the floor, his old joints protesting, and looked directly at Maya. "I don't know if they can see us, darling, I really don't know, but I'll tell you what I learned after losing the person I loved most in the world." He took a deep breath, and Sarah, who was organizing books on the other side of the room, stopped to listen. "I spent so much time trying to keep everything exactly as it was when he was gone. I thought that if I changed anything, if I moved on, it would be like killing him again, like erasing his existence. But you know what I discovered?" Maya shook her head negatively, completely absorbed. "I discovered that they don't live in the things they left behind. They live in what we do with the love they gave us." The words flowed from Edmund with a clarity he didn't know he possessed. It was as if all those weeks of emotional labor, all those tears shed, all those nights confronting inner demons, had distilled into a crystalline truth. Your mother lives on every time you are kind to someone because she taught you kindness. She lives on every time you are brave, even when afraid, because she showed you courage. And if there is something after this life, I believe her greatest joy would be to see you living fully, not clinging to eternal sadness." Maya hugged Edmund so tightly that he felt his heart break and rebuild itself simultaneously. That moment marked a fundamental shift in Edmund's mindset about his own journey. He realized he had been so focused on preserving the past that he had forgotten to honor the future Thomas never had the chance to live. And the most powerful way to honor it wasn't through a locked room filled with dusty objects, but through real and tangible impact on the lives of other children. Children like Maya, who carried their own devastating losses, and desperately needed adults who understood that grief doesn't have an expiration date, but it also doesn't have to be a life sentence. In the months that followed, the Thomas Whitmore Library became much more than a reading space. It became a sanctuary for children dealing with loss. Edmund, without any formal training, became an emotional support figure for dozens of young human beings navigating the turbulent waters of early grief. He didn't pretend to have answers. He didn't offer empty cliches about heaven or divine plans. He offered presence. He offered the raw wisdom of someone who had been at the bottom of the pit of pain and had chosen to slowly, painfully, climb back into the light. Sarah watched this transformation with genuine admiration. The man she had met 6 months ago, silent and paralyzed by unprocessed grief, had become someone completely different. Not that the sadness had disappeared. It was still there, visible in his eyes every time he looked at Thomas's photo, now prominently displayed in the library instead of hidden behind a locked door. But it was an integrated sadness, no longer a paralyzing force, but a motivating one. Edmund had transformed his greatest trauma into his greatest legacy. And then came the unexpected revelation. Maya's aunt, on a rainy afternoon in March, appeared at the mansion and asked to speak with Edmund privately. Sarah was nervous, thinking there might be some problem. But when the woman emerged from Edmund's office an hour later, both had red eyes but were smiling. Edmund called Sarah and told her. Maya's aunt had asked if he would consider becoming a sort of official mentor to the girl, not legally, but emotionally. A grandfather figure she had lost along with her mother. Edmund accepted without hesitation. And in that moment, Sarah understood the hidden truth behind this entire painful journey. Healing is never a straight line. It's a spiral. You visit the same places of pain, repeatedly, but each time from a slightly different angle, a slightly higher vantage point. And eventually, if you do the work, if you don't run away, those places of pain transform into places of wisdom, into places from where you can reach out and help others who are still in the darkest stages of the journey. And it was precisely through this new connection with Maya that Edmund finally managed to do the most difficult thing of all, something he had avoided for more than 2 decades. The hardest thing Edmund finally managed to do was visit Thomas's grave. For 22 years he hadn't been to the cemetery even once, not because he didn't want to honor his grandson's memory, but because going to the cemetery meant irrevocably accepting that Thomas was truly dead, that it wasn't a nightmare he would eventually wake up from, that small body was really buried beneath the cold earth of Portland. It was such a brutal truth that Edmund simply couldn't face it, so he avoided it, for more than 2 decades. But on a clear April morning, with Maya by his side holding his wrinkled hand with childlike confidence, Edmund was finally ready. Sarah drove the 3 of them to Riverview Cemetery, a tranquil place surrounded by ancient oak trees where Eleanor was also buried. The impact of seeing the gravestone was physical. Edmund literally staggered, and Sarah had to hold his arm to keep him from falling. There it was, engraved in grey granite. Thomas. Alexander Whitmore, born May 1991, died September 1998. 7 years. Only 7 years in this world. Edmund knelt on the grass, still damp with morning dew, his old joints protesting, but he didn't care. His hands touched the cold stone, and something inside him finally surrendered completely. It was no more resistance, it was no more denial. It was pure and simple acceptance of the most painful reality of his life. "I'm so sorry, Thomas," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for locking you in that room for so long. I'm so sorry for not knowing how to process your loss in a healthier way. I'm so sorry for all the years I spent frozen instead of living the way you would have wanted me to live." Maya, with the strange wisdom that children who have faced early loss sometimes develop, knelt beside Edmund and placed her little hand on his. "My therapist says that the people we love never want us to stop living because of them. She says the best way to honor those who are gone is to live so fully that they feel proud of where they are." Edmund looked at that 7-year-old girl and saw not only Maya but also Thomas, not physically, but in essence, in the ability to see hope where adults only see pain, in the ability to believe in transformation when the world seems irremediably broken. It was at that moment, kneeling before the grave he had avoided for 22 years, that Edmund finally understood something fundamental about his journey. He had spent more than 2 decades believing that honoring Thomas meant preserving every detail exactly as it was on the day he died. But true honor lay in letting the love Thomas brought into his life multiply, spread, touch other lives. It lay in taking the most devastating pain of his existence and transforming it into something that mattered, into something that made a real and tangible difference in the world. Edmund stood there for almost an hour. He told Thomas, speaking in a low but clear voice, about the library, about the children who came every Saturday, about Maya and how she had helped him see that life goes on not as a betrayal of the dead, but as a tribute to them, about Sarah and how a young nurse with extraordinary empathy had opened that locked door and in doing so had also unlocked his heart, about Mrs. Henderson who had finally removed that chain with the key from her neck because the key was no longer needed. The doors, literal and metaphorical, were open now. When they finally stood up to leave, Edmund did something that surprised even Sarah. He smiled, not a sad or melancholy smile, but a genuine smile of peace. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said, looking at the 2 of them. "I needed to do this a long time ago. I needed to say a real goodbye so I could say hello for the rest of my life." The scarcity mindset, that embracing the present meant betraying the past, had finally given way to an abundance mindset. The mindset that love is not a finite resource. That loving other children did not diminish the love he felt for Thomas, that living fully was not disrespecting the dead, but rather the deepest way to honor them. Behind this external transformation lay a brutal internal process that Edmund had undertaken. Therapy, bereavement support groups, honest and painful conversations with Sarah about guilt, regret, and the impossibility of controlling the uncontrollable. It hadn't been linear. There were relapses. There were nights when the pain returned in full force. But the difference now was that Edmund no longer ran from it. He felt it, he processed it, and the next day he got up and carried on. If you've ever had to make peace with something or someone from your past in order to move on, write this down. Making peace liberates. These words have immense power, and it was precisely this ability to make peace with the past that allowed Edmund to make a final decision that no one, absolutely no one, was expecting. A decision that would take his journey of transformation to a completely different place. The decision Edmund made 3 months after that cemetery visit was as bold as it was transformative. He announced that he wanted to formalize the Thomas Whitmore Library as a non-profit organization dedicated specifically to supporting bereaved children. Not just a reading space, but a comprehensive program with therapists specializing in childhood grief, support groups, and therapeutic activities through art and literature. It was ambitious, it was expensive, and it was absolutely necessary. Edmund had discovered during those months that Portland had limited resources for children processing traumatic losses, and he wanted to fill that gap in a meaningful way. Sarah was impressed by the clarity of purpose Edmund demonstrated. This was no longer the paralyzed man she had known a year ago. This was someone who had transformed his greatest wound into his greatest mission. Edmund began to work tirelessly, despite being 88 years old. He met with lawyers to establish the foundation. He contacted therapists specializing in childhood grief. He started a fundraising campaign in the Portland community. And the response was absolutely overwhelming. People who had lost loved ones who understood the isolating nature of grief contributed generously, not only with money, but with time, expertise, and stories of their own journeys through loss. The impact of this initiative began to spread far beyond the boundaries of Whitmore Manor. Local newspapers covered the story. A particularly touching report aired on the local television station showing Edmund surrounded by children in the library, reading a story about stars and destinies. The reporter asked what motivated him to do this work at 88 years old, when many of his contemporaries were simply resting. Edmund's answer was simple but profound. I wasted 22 years of my life locked in pain. I will not waste the years I have left. I will use them to ensure that other people do not make the same mistake I made. That interview touched thousands of people. Sarah received calls from all over the country from people wanting to replicate the model in their own communities, from people who had their own emotional locked rooms and who saw in Edmund's story permission to finally open those doors. The hidden truth that Edmund was revealing to the world was that unprocessed grief doesn't disappear with time. It calcifies. It hardens. It becomes part of the structure of your identity in ways that profoundly limit your ability to live fully. But it doesn't have to be that way. With adequate support, with a willingness to do the painful work, with the courage to face what is locked behind those metaphorical doors, transformation is absolutely possible. Maya became a sort of unofficial spokesperson for the foundation. She spoke at fundraising events about how the program had helped her process her mother's death in ways she didn't even know she needed to. She talked about group therapy sessions, where she met other children who had also lost parents, and how liberating it was to realize she wasn't alone in this devastating experience. She spoke of Edmund with a fondness that was reciprocated and genuine, calling him Grandpa Edmund, with his happy permission. And every time she spoke, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Edmund's journey had become bigger than himself. It had become a message of hope for anyone carrying unresolved pain. The message was clear. It's never too late to do the healing work. It's never too late to transform trauma into purpose. It's never too late to open those doors you locked because it hurt too much to face what was on the other side. And what you find when you finally open those doors may not be less painful, but it will certainly be freer. It will be authentic. It will be real. And from that authenticity is born the possibility of truly living again. Sarah continued working as Edmund's caregiver, but her role had evolved dramatically. She was now the executive director of the Thomas Whitmore Foundation, managing programs, coordinating volunteers, and ensuring that Edmund's vision materialized sustainably. She had found her own calling through this unexpected journey. She had discovered that her greatest gift was not just caring for sick bodies, but being present for wounded souls in a way that allowed for genuine healing. Mrs. Henderson, now 72, had also experienced her own silent transformation. She had carried guilt all those years, feeling that perhaps she should have pushed Edmund harder to seek professional help, to process his grief in a healthier way. But Sarah helped her understand that each person has their own timing for healing, that forcing someone before they are ready usually results in more resistance, not progress. But there was one last piece in this journey of transformation that still needed to be put in place. A final revelation that would happen exactly 1 year after that night, when Sarah opened Thomas's bedroom door for the first time. A revelation that would show that sometimes... The final revelation came one October afternoon, exactly 1 year after Sarah had first arrived at that mansion. The Thomas Whitmore Foundation was celebrating its first anniversary with a special event in the library. There were over 100 people present. Children, parents, therapists, volunteers, all celebrating the extraordinary impact that space had had on their lives. Edmund was sitting in a comfortable armchair, surrounded by children sitting on the floor around him, when something unexpected happened. A woman in her 40s approached shyly, holding the hand of a boy of about 10. She waited patiently until Edmund finished reading the story he was telling, and then introduced herself in a trembling voice. "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Jennifer. I don't know if you remember me, but I was Thomas's friend in school. We were classmates." Edmund stood completely still. 23 years had passed. Jennifer was a child the last time he had seen her, probably at Thomas's funeral. Now she was a grown woman, a mother, carrying her own stories. "Thomas talked about you all the time," she continued, tears in her eyes. "He said you were the smartest person in the world, and that when he became an astronaut, he would take you to the moon." Edmund couldn't hold back the tears. But these were different tears from those he had shed so many times before. They were tears of gratitude for this unexpected memory, for this connection to the past that didn't hurt in the same paralyzing way as before. Jennifer then did something extraordinary. She handed Edmund a small worn cardboard box. "I've kept this all these years. I didn't know if I should bring it, but when I heard about the foundation, I felt it was the right time." Inside the box were drawings, childish drawings Thomas had made at school. Drawings of rockets, planets, stars, and in each one an astronaut with a smiling old man beside him. The emotional impact of that moment was profound, not only for Edmund, but for everyone who witnessed it. Sarah, observing from afar, perceived something fundamental about the nature of healing. It is never complete. It is never definitive. There will always be moments that reopen those old wounds. But the difference lies in how you deal with those moments. Edmund didn't run away. He didn't lock those emotions behind a door. He felt them completely, embraced Jennifer with genuine gratitude, and allowed that pain to coexist with the joy of knowing that Thomas's memory continued to live on in places he didn't even know existed. That night, after everyone had left, Edmund asked Sarah to go upstairs with him to Thomas's library. They sat together in the reading nook that used to be the boys' bed, and Edmund carefully spread the drawings out on the floor. "Do you know what's most incredible about all this?" he asked, looking at Sarah with eyes that now held wisdom instead of just sadness. "I spent 22 years believing I had lost everything of Thomas, that when he died, everything went away with him. But the truth is, he left his mark on so many lives. Jennifer kept these drawings for over 2 decades. The children who come here every week are being touched by a love he planted in me. I haven't lost everything. I just wasn't looking in the right places." That understanding represented the culmination of a mindset shift that had taken a whole year of hard work. Edmund had moved from a state of scarcity, where he believed that love and memory were finite resources that could be depleted, to a state of abundance where he understood that love multiplies when it is shared, that memories come alive when they are told. That legacy is not about preserving the past in amber, but about allowing it to inform and enrich the present. Edmund's journey had revealed universal truths about human nature and our relationship with loss. It had shown that vulnerability is not weakness, but the path to genuine connection, that asking for help is not failure, but courage, That processing grief requires time, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort without trying to escape it. That healing doesn't mean forgetting or getting over it, but integrating the loss in such a way that it no longer controls the entire narrative of your life. Maya, who now spent almost every weekend at the mansion, had developed a special relationship with Edmund that benefited them both deeply. She helped him stay grounded in the present, while he helped her process her own grief with the wisdom of someone who had walked through that dark valley and found their way back to the light. If you believe that the marks we leave on the world continue to live on long after we're gone, write this: legacy is love in action. Because that's exactly what Edmund and Thomas taught us. And now, as we approach the end of this extraordinary story, there is one last lesson that needs to be shared. A lesson about... The final lesson this journey teaches us is about the transformative power of human presence. Sarah had no special training in grief therapy. She wasn't a psychologist or a licensed counselor. She was simply a 28-year-old nurse who did something extraordinarily simple and yet profoundly rare. She was present, completely present, without judgment, without haste, without an agenda to fix Edmund or rush his healing. And it was precisely this unconditional presence that created the safe space necessary for transformation to happen organically. 2 years after that first night when Sarah opened the door to Thomas's room, the foundation had expanded to 3 locations in Portland and was in the process of opening branches in Seattle and San Francisco. The model created by Edmund and Sarah was being replicated in communities across the country. Therapists specializing in childhood grief were using the protocols developed by the foundation. Academic researchers were studying the program's effectiveness. And most importantly, hundreds of children were receiving the support they desperately needed to process their losses in healthy ways, avoiding decades of unresolved pain like Edmund had experienced. Edmund, now 90 years old, remained active in the foundation, although at a reduced capacity due to his advanced age. But his impact went far beyond the hours he physically spent in the library. He had become a living symbol that it is never too late to do healing work, that you can carry pain for decades and still find your way back to the light. That transformation is possible at any age, under any circumstances, if you have the courage to face what is locked inside you. Maya, now 10 years old, had become a remarkably resilient young woman. She still missed her mother every day. The pain hadn't gone away, but she had learned through the program and her relationship with Edmund that feeling pain doesn't mean being broken, that grief is simply the price we pay for having loved deeply, and that it's possible to carry sadness and joy simultaneously, that they are not mutually exclusive but rather integrated parts of the complete human experience. The mindset that Edmund had developed throughout this journey was something he now tried to pass on to every person who came through the foundation. The mindset that our worst moments don't have to define us permanently, that trauma can be transformed into wisdom, that wounds can become sources of compassion, that what breaks us can, if we allow it, eventually make us more whole in ways we never would have been without that break. Sarah had become a nationally recognized leader in the field of bereavement support. She gave talks at conferences, wrote articles for specialized publications, and was working on a book about her and Edmund's journey. But despite all this public visibility, she remained fundamentally the same compassionate person who had arrived at that mansion 2 years earlier. Her greatest skill continued to be simply being present with other people's pain without trying to fix or diminish it. Mrs. Henderson, who had been a silent witness to this entire transformation, finally allowed herself to process her own grief related to the loss of Thomas. She had loved that boy as if he were her own grandson. She had been present on that devastating morning when Edmund found Thomas lifeless. She had carried her own guilt and sorrow for 23 years, feeling that perhaps she had failed to protect that precious child. Through the work that was happening at the foundation, she finally sought therapy to process these buried emotions. And she discovered, to her surprise, that healing was possible even for wounds that had been festering for so long. The hidden truth that everyone in this story discovered: each in their own way, was that isolation is the greatest enemy of healing. That shared pain is divided pain. That vulnerability creates connection. That admitting you are suffering and need help is not weakness. It is the first courageous step towards living authentically again. Edmund had spent 22 years isolated in his pain, believing that no one could understand, that it was better not to talk about it, that time would eventually heal everything. But time alone heals nothing. It only freezes the wound in place. It is time plus intention plus support plus courage that creates true healing. And now, as this extraordinary story comes to its natural conclusion, there is one last thing that needs to be said. Something about the deeper meaning of everything that happened in that mansion in Portland goes far beyond the specific story of Edmund and Thomas. It's about all of us, about the locked rooms each of us carries within, about the pain we avoid facing because it seems safer to keep the door closed, about the transformations waiting on the other side of our courage to finally turn that doorknob. Edmund Whitmore is 93 years old today. He wakes up every morning with renewed purpose. The mansion that for so many years was a mausoleum of silence now pulsates with life. Children arrive every week to hear stories, participate in support groups, and learn that their losses do not define them but can eventually strengthen them. Sarah remains by Edmund's side, no longer just as his caregiver, but as a partner in this mission to transform pain into hope. And that room on the second floor, that space that remained locked for 22 years, now has its doors wide open. Light streams freely through the windows, laughter echoes off the walls painted blue with white clouds, and in some poetic and deeply moving way, it seems that Thomas is finally at peace. The door was never locked again, and perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all, that keeping doors open, even when it hurts, even when it's frightening, is the only way to truly live. Look, if you've made it this far with me in this story, you're not just someone who watches YouTube videos. You're someone who values real human connection, who understands that stories matter, who believes we can learn from other people's journeys. And I want to continue sharing these stories with you. So subscribe to the channel, because every week I bring real accounts like this one, stories that remind us of our humanity, our capacity for transformation, our strength when we decide to face what's locked inside us. And do me a favor, leave a comment below saying, "I made it to the end." I read every comment personally, and knowing that you were with me from beginning to end of this journey means more than you can imagine. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like too. It's not just a button, it's you saying that this kind of content matters, that stories like this deserve to be shared. And look, there's a video over here about how to process loss in a healthy way that complements everything we've talked about here. Click and continue the conversation there, because it doesn't have to end now. See you in the next video, and remember, it's never too late to open that door.